Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm again here. I hope I'm not boring you. But first of all, I would like to convey the apologies of Professor Ray Juraidini. Due to some health circumstances, he's not able to make it. He's supposed to be the moderator of this session, but it's with great pleasure that I accept this, and I'm happy that you are here. And I would like to start by also welcoming our distinguished speakers in this afternoon, or in this second session. We have with us outstanding scholars, speakers from many countries, but something which I would like to offer in this session, that it is a practical and applied session where you will be perhaps excited to learn about, case studies from various angles and different methodologies, and I'm sure you will be excited to listen and hear and interact with our distinguished speakers. With this brief introduction, I would like to introduce briefly also, so that we can have time, because all the bios of our distinguished speakers are in the booklet, in the conference booklet. So I'm not going to repeat them, but it's with great pleasure I would like to introduce the first speaker, our Professor Emeritus, Professor Dale Ackerman. He's from the States, from the United States of America, and he is one of the most prominent anthropologists who is, concerned and also, deeply and well-versed in the field of theology and religions, and he is very familiar with the Arab and Middle Eastern world, and also the Muslim presence and existence in the West. So without further ado, I would like to invite our distinguished Professor Dale Ackerman to deliver his lecture, and then we will move to the second speaker. Professor Dale, please.
Thank you very much, Fateh. I immediately will deny being a theologian. I will leave that to anybody else you choose in the room. Having said that, the most profound long-term transformations, at least in my view, in the Muslim world today, occur through the actions of middle-class professionals and religious intellectuals. They take charge of their faith, organize people, popularize ideas, and seek to persuade large and diverse audiences. They rethink religion outside traditional boundaries, even if they deny they're doing so. They master rapid technological shifts, organize movements and affinity groups, and work often as teams with different skills. That's one thing that comes with being middle class, as I'm using the term, behind the scenes, and recognize the institutional challenges of persuading diverse audiences. I was delighted to hear Sheikh Abdul Fattah speak today, because in his language, with a background that I think you would agree might be a little bit different than mine, he very clearly set out much of what I'm going to say in a very different language. Mainstreaming results in presenting Islam as an integral and acceptable part of civic life. Participation in mainstreaming, best thought of more as a process than as a specific outcome, requires the development of concrete skills and aptitudes. Again, think about what Sheikh Mourou was saying this morning. The outcome of mainstreaming, increased levels of civility and tolerance, or its very opposite, is far from certain. Since the rise of digital communications, the mix of how people communicate and perceive the common good, al-maslahat al-amma, has been significantly transformed. One path to understanding how the digital age shapes ideas and practices is to look to the distant past and how earlier big ideas took hold, and then to look at how the digital age affects how we think today. So let me go to 7th century Arabia, as distant as perhaps we can get. to the ties that bind, the multiple and layered bonds of loyalty and obligation that range from parents and kin, spouses, town and tribe, and the wider community of believers in 7th century Arabia, the Quran added the firmest tie, al-urwa al-wuthqa. This tie linked individual believers to God. At least in principle, this firmest link preceded but did not replace other ties. Al-urwa al-wuthqa in the 7th century, with its emphasis on equality and personal responsibility among believers, was remarkably modern in the high degree of commitment, involvement, and participation expected from the rank and file members of the community. Yet to the original audiences in 7th century Arabia, the firmest tie, al-urwa al-wuthqa again, did not always appear more immediate and compelling than tribal and kin loyalties. Upon Muhammad's death in 632, the period of the so-called Ridda, or apostasy, many tribes considered themselves released from submission to Islam. In other words, ties of tribe and loyalty negotiated by the early Islamic community were incompletely realized. At-Tabari records a hadith in which a member of the Bani Rabi'a met with Musaylima bin Habib, or Musaylima al-Kadhab, also from the Bani Rabi'a. The visitor asked Musaylima, "Who comes to you?" And Musaylima answered, "Ar-Rahman, in light or in shadows?" Musaylima replies, "In shadows." The visitor then says, "I testify that you are a liar, and that Muhammad is telling the truth, but a liar of the Rabi'a is better for us than a true prophet of the Mudar," which of course is Muhammad's tribal group. Of course, the conditions in which the firmest tie was realized and actually took precedence over the other ties have been a core question throughout Muslim history. The first news in the 7th century of the firmest tribe was spread solely by word of mouth, with reliable information and the equivalent of today's fake news, often hard to untangle. To make a leap of many centuries in a different context, in the summer of 1789 in the French countryside, rumors spread about vengeful aristocrats bent on the destruction of peasants' property. These rumors were absolutely untrue. The Great Fear, as this period is now known in France, tipped France into revolution with a flurry of fact-free gossip and rumor. Today, of course, rumors fly much faster. Word of mouth is buttressed by an array of digital and electronic media, and the search for reliable accounts is more difficult than ever before. The smartphone, I was going to show you a smartphone. This is a dumb phone. May level the playing field between the producers and consumers of ideas and practices, but it also makes for short attention spans. If we look at the most profound changes in how ideas get communicated, there's three major drivers that have influenced how ideas move through society and across geographical and linguistic boundaries. The first is the greater ease of travel. Travel can be for the Hajj, as well as visits to regional shrines, for commerce, or for labor migration, or from the necessity of war or regional conflict. Pilgrimage and migration, for economic purposes, have equally profound effects, not all of which are intended, on the religious imagination. As the late Zafar Ishaq Ansari observed over 2 decades ago, the boundaries between the West and the rest are no longer exclusively territorial. A second driver is mass education, which has meant the spread of literacy to large numbers of people, women and men throughout the world. I vividly recall traveling in small towns and villages throughout the Arab world in the 1960s. In Afech, a small town in southern Iraq's Diwania province in 1968, an afternoon male habit was to sit in a coffee shop where a literate tribal leader read aloud the afternoon newspaper that arrived from Baghdad. I saw similar scenes in Upper Egypt and southern Morocco the same year. Before the wide spread of literacy in small towns and rural areas in some regions, even the Arabic spoken word failed to reach many Arabs if they possessed only their regional dialect. Now, of course, the more widespread mastery of formal Arabic allows more people to talk back in public space than was possible in an earlier era. Third, the new communications media have become increasingly interactive. In the past, the proliferation of video cassettes and CDs combined with satellite broadcasting loosened the hold of state broadcasters over the imagination of large numbers of people. Before internet and mobile communications were widely available, the proliferation of photocopiers and fax machines allowed competing messages to be readily communicated independently of authorized channels and distributed among networks of like-minded people. Cell phones, and especially smartphones, combined with the wide array of means of communicating via the internet, make the older top-bottom control of messages less effective than it was in an earlier era. In the 1970s, the humble audio cassette, easy to duplicate, conceal, and smuggle, facilitated the rise of new and dissident voices beyond the written, printed, and photocopied word. Since the advent in the 1990s of the internet age, communication has become even easier, and over the last 15 years, platforms such as Facebook, introduced in 2004, Twitter, 2006, and WhatsApp, 2009, have further facilitated the competition over religious and political authority. Religious innovation does not advance through technological change alone. One needs people adept in seizing the opportunity that technical innovation offers and the ability to work with others in new and not fully predictable ways to mainstream religious innovation. Mainstreaming involves four major skills. First, it requires intellectuals who take charge of developing ideas and using them to persuade large audiences, especially where organized non-governmental movements are strongly discouraged or monitored. The second set of skills is the overt public organizing of people and communicating effectively. States, including both open and totalitarian ones, depend on middle-class professionals, just as successful religious and civic movements try to sell the ideas and practices of certain ways of putting faith to work in society. There's a country neighboring to here, I'm not going to name it, where I know the chief police censor. He would go to book fairs to determine which books should be censored in his country. However, he had the books, and he had what I called in my field notes the Censor's Book Club, so that his friends, a wide circle of friends, could read the banned books that they would get from him. It's nice to see censors helping distribute words that are supposed to be banned. Unfortunately, not all censors are intellectuals. A third related skill is working quietly behind the scenes to further an interest or cause where weak forms of civic empowerment are linked to strong forms of structure, such as in some countries where major state-sponsored initiatives are underway to use the Islamic studies curriculum of primary and secondary schools to create a template for inculcating values of critical thinking, gender parity, and religious tolerance. A final skill is that of publicity trumping secrecy. Trump is a good verb in English. It's recently been discouraged in use, but I leave that to the translators to explain. Publicity can overcome suspicion. It contributes significantly to normalizing new ideas and practices. It also encourages the objectification, tamawdu'a, of religious ideas and practices. Ideas that were primarily implicit become explicit. One result is that certain questions come to be foregrounded in the consciousness of large numbers of believers. Questions such as this: what is my religion? Why is it important to my life? And how do my beliefs guide my conduct? Objectification does not mean seeing religion as a uniform or monolithic entity, although for some, that's precisely what it is, or they say it is. These explicit and objective questions are distinctly modern ones, even as some people legitimate their practices by asserting a return to the past. The digital age has profoundly affected the meaning and context of the public sphere and religious belief and practice within it. Just as writing and print created often and unanticipated new forms of community in the past and transformed authority and social boundaries, so has the digital age. Increasingly open and accessible forms of communication make contests over the authoritative use of the symbolic language of Islam, as with other religious beliefs and practices, increasingly global and open. The struggle over people's imaginations now involves both a heightened competition and contest over both the interpretation of symbols and a struggle over the control of the institutions, formal and informal, that produce and sustain them. To conclude, the mainstreaming of Islamic ideas and practices contributes to increasingly public Islam, in which religious scholars, self-ascribed religious authorities, non-religious intellectuals, such as the late Sadiq Jalal al-Azam of Syria, Sufi orders, mothers, students, workers, engineers, and many others contribute to civic debate and public life. In this public capacity, Islam makes a difference in configuring the politics and social life in large parts of the globe, and not just among self-ascribed religious authorities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Dale, for this in-depth presentation and also for abiding with the time. Excellent. So I would like to move on to our second speaker, our distinguished speaker in this session, Her Excellencies Lulwa Rashid Al-Khater. She is the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the State of Qatar. And it's a great honor to have her with us. And we know she is very busy. She is also engaged in lots of activities, but she managed to make it. Thank you very much. So the floor is yours. She will speak about media, media, the Arab Spring, and the could have been public sphere. Lulia, please. Feel free to stand or to go to the podium over there. Or
I'll just use the podium.
no problem. And you have the pointer with you.
I just click, right. Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah.
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, I am glad to be amongst you, the CIF, and indeed my joy is doubled because the invitation came from CILE. I would like to commend the founder of CILE, those in charge of CILE, and the staff. If you could allow me, I will be speaking in English.
Good afternoon. Just as Professor Ackerman was about to put on the translation, I think I switched to English. It's a great honor to be here with the distinguished panelists. And I was telling Professor Ackerman moments ago that his work has actually enlightened my research, and for that I'm actually very grateful. Just before I start, I wear multiple hats. So I have the hat, the official hat, but then I have the research hat. And I would like to say that I'm here today mainly on my research capacity rather than the official capacity. Therefore, any views I present today only represent my own views and do not necessarily represent the views of any institution that I'm affiliated with. With that said, maybe I should start with the main course, and that is my presentation today titled The Arab Spring and the Could Have Been Public Sphere. الربيع العربي والفضاء العام الذي كان ممكنا. This is basically more or less a case study. In the case study, I focus on Egypt between the 11th of February 2011, just after the fall of Mubarak, and May 2012. That is just before the election of Morsi, and there is a very mythological reason for choosing this time frame for my argument. So forget everything you know about the trajectory of the Arab Spring. This is very important because the time frame I'm talking about is before everything else that happened post 2013. That was the Arab Spring back then. Look at it. Tahrir Square, Occupy Wall Street, everyone around the world was celebrating the Arab Spring. That was the spirit back then. And if you look at the photos here, you can see a woman wearing the niqab and isdal with another sister wearing the cross. And likewise, you have a priest and a sheikh next to each other. Once again, that was the spirit. Just forget anything else that you know about the trajectory of events later on. Now, the time frame, why did I choose this time frame? Two very mythological reasons. One, the moment that followed overthrowing Mubarak through a peaceful and civil movement inspired the public imaginary that non-coercive action could be as effective. Now, whether we believe in that or not right now, that was the sentiment back then. And the other reason is that in the aftermath of the fall of Mubarak, all non-governmental actors actually engaged in the public sphere. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. And then the other reason is basically to avoid the debate that followed the election of Morsi. For a reason it's not relevant at all to the arguments I'm going to make. And of course, this is a descriptive analysis and not a normative one. So I'm not necessarily adopting the views I'm going to present, but I'm trying to describe and understand the dynamics back then. In terms of the method, I focused, when it comes to the material, on the evening talk shows. And I focus mainly on the elections, the presidential elections, 2012, and how that was described in the media back then. Now, I would like to draw your attention to, I'm not sure, this pointer doesn't have like a light or something, but then I'm not sure if you can see on the screen the circle, the white, the red circle. Again, that was the spirit. I mean, you have a liberal presenter, but then the lady who's doing the sign language has, you know, not even the hijab, the abaya, something we didn't see prior to the Arab Spring. And then this is the presidential elections, 2012. And the manner of, the prudent manner, I should say, of covering the elections in 2012 and the evening talk shows and the media outlets was just astonishing. I mean, everyone was literally given a chance to engage equally. They were given the same time. They were given the same opportunity. You would see Morsi debating with Shafiq. You would see Mohammed Salim Al-Awa debating with Amr Musa. Even those who are not known to the public were given the opportunity to engage and to speak to the public about the public good of the Egyptian nation. What is the public sphere that we're talking about. Now, I'm very grateful once again to Professor Ackerman because he gave us a chronology. And actually, I have a quote from him here. So the result of advances in communication and transportation has been challenges to authoritarianism, the fragmentation of religious and political authority, and increasingly open discussions of issues related to the common good. And that we have certainly seen during the Arab Spring. So while the state preserved its monopoly over coercion in the name of the public good, other societal actors, these would be political parties, traditional powers like the Muslim Brotherhood, or even the new youth activists, those claimed equal rights to self-representation through rational reasoning of what this public good actually means and how it is to be realized. So the public sphere I'm talking about here is this equally accessible space in which universal public reasoning about the common good of the nation is taking place, is, I say, the arguably could have been public sphere in Egypt. How is this public sphere new? I mean, again, people have been talking about the print media and the kind of public sphere it created. The cassette with the Sahwa movement in the 80s and early 90s. That was also, that created some sort of a public sphere to debate what is public good and so on and so forth. How is this new in the aftermath of the Arab Spring or the time frame that I have specified? Well, one thing is the scale of the public participation, which included all sects, regardless of their religion, gender, education, or social status. Now, this is unprecedented. And in the third point, I'm going to elaborate a little bit more on this. And then, this was distinctive in the sense that the political and the moral authority of the public participation is again unprecedented. For the first time, there was this common sense that the public matters. And of course, now we can compare this to another phenomenon, which is more of a global phenomenon, the disengagement from the political debate altogether. And that's why many political scientists are talking today about the need to bring politics back in, because people are resorting to their own identities, ethnic identities, religious identities, to substitute this political belonging, which we saw in a certain period with, for example, socialism and capitalism and so on and so forth. So for the first time, politics was kind of back in, at least for a moment. And then the third point is, and this is very important, the merge of previously isolated spheres into a universal sphere. Let me give you one example. In Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, no one had anticipated that we would see this intensive presence of Salafism in Tunisia. No one had imagined that. And of course, some of the superficial accounts were like, oh, this is the immediate result of Islamists trying to take over the public sphere. It cannot be. This socio-political presence is rooted in the society. The difference is the following. For decades, regimes have confiscated the public sphere, and they have played the mediation role. They've been the mediator between the different silos that have always existed. So there was a confiscated public sphere, and on the margins of that public sphere, different actors, different parties, different communities were pushed to the margins. So what happened in the aftermath of the Arab Spring is that suddenly this mediator, the state, the regimes, did not exist or withdrew for a moment, and suddenly those different silos merged together. And this is the, once again, could have been public sphere. And the examples can go on. The new conditions resulted new dynamics. Different actors engaged willingly, equally, rationally, in the political process and public debate in accordance to terms generated outside their own worldview. Now, while we might agree on the willingly engagement and the equally side of things, we might question the rational engagement of the different actors. And I would argue in favor of that there was a rationalization process that was taking place. And I'll give one example. Islamists had to enter a public reasoning process, subjecting their own religiously deliberative premises to be negotiated within a national framework. They found themselves part of a public debate, having to appeal to different audiences that don't necessarily share the same premises that they have. And that's why they had to rationalize. That's why we saw figures. Some of them, for example, are Salafi figures or MB figures or other Islamist figures who would argue, for example, use quote-unquote secular arguments to justify religious positions. To give one example, I remember very well the question about the dress code. It was always asked in media outlets, even though they had much bigger problems, but for some reason that was the question always. What is the dress code, the appropriate dress code in beaches, for example? And then one figure, I remember Salah Abu Ismail, but others as well, were using more or less secular arguments in the sense they were saying, listen, the majority of the people in Egypt are Muslims, are conservatives. Ask them, right? Have a survey and let's find out what they think. This is not a religious argument. This is an argument outside the religious worldview. And this is the rationalization process that was taking place that was unfortunately missed in the midst of that debate that was taking place back then. So some of the overlooked implications in the midst of this ideological and political polemic, one of the characteristics is mediating differences. And this is one of the overlooked, I would say, gains from the Arab Spring, and we have probably missed it. That there was unprecedented universal consensus, not on the principles, not on the ideas, but on the mechanisms of how to negotiate our differences and how to negotiate our identities and so on and so forth. And that was very clear. The discussion was always about freedom of expression, who has access to the media, universal suffrage, elections, constitution, all the debates. Screen them, survey them, do content analysis. You will find out that those are the key words that kept coming up again and again and again, telling you that there was some sort of maybe unspoken consensus that yes, we agree, this is how we need to mediate our differences. The other point is the following. Of course, whenever you mention this point, some people would jump in and say, but wait a minute, those Islamists are trying to use democracy to reach power, to reach authority. Once they do that, remember the analogy of the ladder? They're gonna, what's the expression, throw the ladder or whatever, or take it with them, something like that, right? But then how can we mythologically approach this? Because this question, if you think about it, is a question of intentions, right? That this was their intention. Now, how can any scholar mythologically analyze intentions? If someone has an answer, please let me know. It's almost impossible unless you are analyzing some sort of historical events, and then you can, have your speculations. Otherwise, forecasting the future is just forecast. I mean, it's not scholarly work, right? But here is the important part. What I would call private justification versus public reasoning. And we kind of need to live with this duality. That under the nation-state setting, where you have multi-faith and multi-ethnic societies or communities, you will always have this duality of private justification and public reasoning. And this is hardly unique to any community or any religion or any political party, etc. Why do I say this? Because, I mean, if we take one example, why does it matter if I, within my own circles, have my own justification based on the book, but when I engage publicly, I engage in accordance to the legal framework and the national framework? Should this matter? We need to ask this question. If I, at the personal level, wear the hijab, for example, because I'm convinced that this is a religious obligation, but then when I justify it publicly, I say, well, this is freedom of my own freedom. Does this really matter? We need to ask those questions. And this is hardly unique to Muslims. If we take the Copts in Egypt, for example, when it comes to the question of divorce, now how does the Coptic Church justify it to its community? Based on the Gospels, based on the book, on the Holy Book. But then, interestingly enough, if you look at the statements made publicly by priests and others in the media when asked about this, they say, our reference is the Constitution. And here is the interesting part. Not only the Constitution, the article that states that Sharia, Islamic Sharia, is a source of legislation. Because according to Islamic Sharia, the peoples of the book have the right to resort to their own Sharia. This is the justification I've heard repetitively, and you can check it out from people who belong to the Coptic Church. They use it publicly. But then privately, they have all the right in the world to have their own justification for their own community. So these points were hugely overlooked in the analysis during the Arab Spring and the period I'm looking at. And I'll conclude with this example because I think I've taken so much time. This is just one example of how this rationalization process can be manifested like publicly in different occasions and incidents. And I have used the extremist example here. This interview happened in 2011, the 11th of March, just after the fall of Mubarak. This is Aboud al-Zumar, the former member of Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya, who was involved directly in planning the assassination of Sadat. This interview happened in less than 24 hours after his release. But then here is the interesting part. How did he, quote unquote, justify? Again, this is a descriptive analysis. It's not a normative analysis. I'm not saying this is good or bad. I'm just describing. So what he said is the following. He was asked several times by the host, Mona Shadli, he was asked, why did they assassinate Sadat? The answer I was expecting, the answer Mona Shadli said she was expecting, is that they accused Sadat of apostasy, and that's why they decided to eliminate him. This is not what he said. He said all channels of expressing opposition were blocked. And the only way for change, according to him, was resorting to violence. I'm not, again, adopting this. I'm just saying this is what he said. Now, this is a very different justification from saying that Sadat was apostate. Very different. And then she asked him, she said, okay, so this means you could repeat it again. He said, no. Post-January revolution, this is not possible. What was his justification? He said, because now we have other means of change. And he referred to the Constitution, and he referred to freedom of expression, and he referred to elections, and he referred to many things. What's the main takeaway from this conversation? Is that rationalizing the discourse through having an inclusive public sphere is possible. There was apparently an opportunity at one point, post the Arab Spring. I would say we probably missed it. Is this possible? Is it possible to reproduce the same conditions? Very difficult. Not least because of the dynamics we have in the Arab region, but because of how media and social media and new media works. Who controls it? Who owns it? who can manipulate it. And we've seen traces of that in the very GCC crisis that we went through as well. I think I've taken so much time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much for your in-depth presentation and motivating talk. I would like to move on to the third speaker, Yusuf Salihin. I would like to introduce him not as a student, but as a young scholar from Egypt who is doing his master's degree here in Muslim societies and civilization. And he is going to address a very interesting case study that is about the issue of Al-Quds in the social media. فليتفضل مشكورا. Yes, Yusuf, please.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أردوا السلام يا جماعة.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. At the outset, dear Lolwa, you have rubbed salt into an old wound. I would like perhaps to ask Aboud Az-Zumar now, what was his reason if he could go back to Egypt? I don't know. And then we've got the most gracious, the most merciful. All blessings are due to our Prophet, peace be upon him.
المركز وأتمنى أن يعني لا يندموا على هذه البدعة الحسنة إن شاء الله. سيكون حديثي لحضراتكم اليوم عن الأمة الرقمية وردود أفعالها خاصة أو كنموذج لإعلان ترامب القدس عاصمة للكيان الصهيوني. وفي البداية على عجالة أريد أن أعرف مفهوم الأمة. أظن أن هذا مهما، وكذلك أتبعه بما أظنه وما أعني به الأمة الرقمية. في البداية الأمة إذا أردنا أن نعرفها في كلمتين قلنا هي أمة.
Ummah or nation is the Ummah of monotheism, and in the Al-Anbiya chapter, Allah talked to the Prophet, peace be upon him, saying, in translation, we have not sent before you any messenger, but we revealed to him that there is no God except me, so worship me. And then the chapter went on to give stories and narrations of prophets and their progenies. And then there was a conclusion of Maryam and her son Jesus. And then Allah Almighty said in translation, this is your nation, one nation, and I am your Lord, therefore worship me. So the belonging of the Muslim to the Ummah or the nation, this is an understanding that transcends time, geography, let alone trans borders and trans tribes. This is the concept of affiliation. It is a comprehensive and wide concept of the nation of monotheism from the time of Adam till the day of judgment. Now, in terms of the digital ummah, we mean the group of Muslims using the internet. Simply put, included in this definition are those who used the web, even if they were dead, and then if those who are alive that do not use that, this is excluded from that definition. Thank you, Dr. Mu'taz. I know you don't like definitions, but this is the definition that I put forward. I say and emphasize that we all agree that social media platforms and the virtual world has brought about a revolution in information and media. It is not a parallel virtual world, but rather it contributes to a large extent in bringing about a change and a direct influence on the true and real world. I think we agree to that. Thus, the paradigm that I suggest is to classify the cycle and the stages of the reactions of the digital ummah in 3 stages, which could be added to, but for the sake of time, I will give 3 stages and give examples. The first stage is paving the way and feeling the pulse and preparing the world opinion and view And this happened in the announcement of Jerusalem. On the 1st of December last year, there were leaks of news that Trump wants to announce Jerusalem as the capital of the Zionist entity. The reaction started that there are concerns, fears, and hashtags launch, and hashtags started flowing. Palestine, or Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine, and Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine forever, even launching threats. Sheikh al-Jafri, he's a Yemeni living in Egypt, supportive of Sisi. This sheikh said, America, we are unlike you. You killed the Aboriginals and you confiscated their land, and I warn you that there is 1.5 billion Muslims who will not stay silent. So this is a threat. Also, there were suggestions by some people such as Dr. Muhammad al-Baradi saying, if this were to happen, we can do such and such. Political embargo or stopping pouring billions of dollars in the US, that's another example. And in light of condemnation and another reaction, some normalizers, Saudi writer at The Hague said Palestinians don't care about you Arabs and they are taking care of themselves. And some youth rejecting normalization gathered these people of normalizers on the internet, and they launched that in video clips under the hashtag the shame list. And Trump on the 16th of December announced that, and then we had an avalanche of news, which is natural. With that, anger voices grew stronger, and theorization and conferences have come about, and blaming Arabs also. For example, poet from Algeria, Muhammad Jarboua, published poetry in his own voice, accusing King Salman that he has sold out, he sold Jerusalem to the West. And I deny that because I didn't perform Hajj and Umrah, so thus until now I am in denial of that. So hear no evil, see no evil, till now. Sheikh Omar Suleiman tweeted from the US in English saying, your embassy is valid just like the occupation that you are trying to legitimize. Mohamed Abu Trika, the soccer player, said, I don't accept the Zionist entity. It doesn't exist, thus it doesn't have a capital. So he dealt with it as an occupation that has no right to the land nor the capital. More than that, Dr. named Ali Farid said decisively, there's nothing worse than those who say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, except those who say that Jerusalem is the capital of Palestine. And then he said, with the stupidity of the latter, the former got victory. And the latter would not get victory unless he undermines the Sykes-Picot results in his mind so that it would be broken down in reality. Here he attacks nationalities, and he said that we have been confined in the realm of nation state, thus we try to defend Jerusalem as the capital of a nation state. Omar Weston also published something saying the same thing, speaking of the campaigns that incite burning the flags of Israel. So he said, we have to burn all the flags, not only the flag of Israel, but we have to transcend the flags which represent nation states and deal with Palestine and Jerusalem as an Islamic, pure Islamic issue. Also some other reactions, for example, Tamil Barghouthi, satire poet from Palestine, said sarcastically on Twitter, let Trump say whatever he wants. Let him say that Jerusalem is the capital of the Zionist entity, and let him say that the sun is a piece of falafel. Another activist saying, warning of the Arab leaders are stupid, just like cigarettes are stupid and useless. And you find caricatures and cartoons that are sarcastic and satirical. Also, statements by sheikhs such as Sheikh al-Qaradawi of a religious nature, saying that the issue of Jerusalem and Palestine is not a mere issue relevant to the Arabs and the Palestinians, but rather it's an issue relevant to the Muslim Ummah in general. And there were such statements also as well. Also, silence was a reaction. You find scholars and preachers who talk about politics and support the politics of their own state, such as in Saudi Arabia and Egypt, completely deafeningly silent. They did not say anything in terms of the issue of Jerusalem or Al-Ghouta, Eastern Ghouta in Syria, so that they don't lose their followers. And those I call secular preachers. This is one stage. The second stage includes calls and taking up a practical position. This is called in English call to action, such as the signature campaigns. Avaz is a well-known website, gathers signatures electronically and take up your name and raises that to the UN to take some resolutions or decisions or reactions. Many campaigns of signatures were launched in support of Jerusalem. Also, the renewal or call for a boycott, whether it is political or economic or individual boycott of products from the Zionist entity. Also, you see campaigns of changing the image and prayer and calls for demonstrations, such as in Tunisia and before the syndicate of journalists in Egypt in support of Egypt, and they were caught by the authorities and arrested. And campaigns to burn flags, and you'll find initiatives for spreading awareness. There was a hashtag called Right or Wrong to document the historical nature of Islam in Jerusalem. Latifa Muhammad launched that. Latifa and Muhammad launched that. Also, Mr. Hassan Nasrallah came out condemning the Trump announcement. Then he would say, with all enthusiasm, and I call all the Muslims to launch what? To launch millions of tweets to undermine the decision of Trump. This is his call. The youth took up that on social media network, and they made fun of him and his call, and also on YouTube. The third and final stage is the fragmentation and forgetfulness and dissipating. In all important events, you see soccer matches come about, and people thus get busy, and the people on Twitter get busy with them, or being busy with internal battles within this same issue. Ula al-Faris is an example on that. This is a presenter in BBC. She tweeted saying, the timing chosen by Trump of this announcement did not come in vacuum, but came after his direct visit to Saudi Arabia. And a wide spectrum of tweeters from Saudi Arabia allocated their life to cuss her and criticize her, and they were busy with that, away from the main issue, and also getting busy with the leaks of the media in Egypt, such as Ashraf al-Khoury, who is supposed to be part of the security apparatus in Egypt, who would direct and compel the media people in Egypt as to how to talk about Jerusalem. He was directing them and commanding them how to do that, and then things dissipate away and they are being forgotten once again. We may go back here to the beginning if another thing happens. So now we are in the stage of forgetfulness and dissipating of the reactions. So they are three stages: receiving the event, reacting to it, and then the reactions which are practical and call to action and taking up positions, and then forgetting and fading away. This, in my view, is just like rain when it comes down slowly and then it pours down, and then there are products being produced, and then it becomes vanishing, and the produce will die. So we begin with an event, we react to it, we try to take up a position, we forget, and then another international event comes about, we get a reaction to it, and we go in this vicious circle endlessly. So we take away from this, I'm about done. So we learn from that is that in most times, the digital ummah is a reflection of the reality of this nation, meaning, in general, they take up reactions to international events, but they are not proactively involved and initiators and originators of events. So everybody is between two schools. The school of despising social and media and digital world and saying that this is all useless and those youth are wasting time and they are stupid and silly people just like me, or exaggerating in its value. Hassan Nasrallah, for example, what he said about destroying the decision of Trump through millions of tweets, this is exaggeration in honoring that. So social media networks and virtual reality is a tool that could be misused. For example, it could be used in cursing and letting out steam, or it could be used for something useful. And so don't despise anything that is of a good nature. Also, do not despise their media. Most democracies now are managed by Twitter, and the Secretary of State was sacked by a Twitter and by a tweet. So don't undermine it. And also the Arab governments launch armies to control social and media and digital world after what happened in the Arab Spring. So we should not suffice ourselves to electronic jihad, even though I say there is an electronic jihad. For example, look at Afiqai Adrai, spokesman of the occupation army of the Zionist entity. He has a mission which he is doing successfully. He fights on social media outlets. He reaches out to the Arab world, and he's successful in that. Lastly, we should prepare ourselves with all tools to spread awareness on social media, but this is not enough. We also need to have jihad on the ground to liberate the land. And finally, I say, oh Allah, guide this nation so that the people of guidance will be successful, and those who are misguided to come back to the faith and to be rightly guided. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Can you please off the microphone? Off the microphone, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Yusuf, for your courage. Kyle here is that freedom of expression, but yes, and Kyle activities, we are proud to have speakers. They can feel free to speak their own mind, without any restriction, and it's up to you how to interact with them, and they're responsible for what they say. Now, without further ado, and last but not least, of course, is the role of Professor Ibrahim Muhammad Zain. He is a distinguished professor in Islamic studies and comparative religion. I've known him for three decades, or 2 decades, or more than that. I really always enjoy talking to him and going to his office, interacting with him. But today his role is to talk about Facebook accounts, and of course his presentation is also somehow a case study. Professor Ibrahim Zain, so the floor is yours, please. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله الكريم وبعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى.
Peace be upon you, Allah's blessings and His mercy. First and foremost, please allow me to extend my gratitude to CILE for this invitation to this successful conference. I have listened to Sheikh Nuru in the morning and I was over the moon. And later on, the first session tackled the issue of philosophy and it elevated us to the sky, if I might say. Please allow me to speak in English now.
Session, which is part of it, is supposed to be speaking about particular cases. And the learned speakers before me actually said so many important things, and I agree with most of the things that they have said. And in my case, I have a very, very particular thing. They were speaking about particulars, but in my submission, I'll be very, very particular. And I would like to tell you the story behind this very, very particular submission of mine. But after I wrote the abstract, I have two of my daughters. They are staying with me these days. And last night I was talking to them that how I go about and make a presentation about Facebook. And I was supposed to analyze two accounts, as you know, and I gave them the abstract of mine, and I was supposed to focus on a very important critique of modernity, which is a critique of the prejudice, or actually the prejudice against the prevailing prejudice, and how Muslims actually would be using Facebook to mediate that kind of critique of the prevailing prejudice. I had a very nice discussion, and that discussion actually has been reflected in what I'll be presenting to you. So I have to acknowledge the fact that most of the ideas which were contributed after I wrote the abstract, but the details of how to go about and analyze the two Facebook accounts actually were done by my two interesting, I guess, daughters, which was the first experience, of me when I'm writing a paper. Usually I shut myself and I don't talk to anybody and I write. But this time, to my surprise, and perhaps next times, whenever I wanted to do any kind of public speech, perhaps it's very important to listen to young people like my two daughters. Now, the first thing is the structure of my presentation. I apologize for the typos in my written text. So the first thing I'll be talking about is a general introduction on religion and the internet. And the second thing is about specific introduction on Facebook as a source for data on religions and social cultural values. I'm using the internet only as a source for data, not as a methodological tool. The third thing is how to study these two accounts, ? And then the question of the prejudice against the prevailing prejudice in two selected examples, and finally, my concluding remarks. Now, the first thing is that I would put this statement forward that clearly the popular inception of the internet, the World Wide Web, in the 90s, in the middle of the 90s, ushered in Al-Faruqi's concept of a citizen of the religious world community. This concept actually has been developed by Al-Faruqi in the 60s, and he was presenting this, that if we wanted to talk about religion in the public space, we've got to keep in mind that we have to participate in the public space as a citizen of the religious world community to make sense to others. Now, it means religion is not a private matter, and it shouldn't be discussed only inside churches, mosques, and synagogues. This new citizenship is, by and large, a virtual one, and certainly is the outcome of the computer-mediated communication. Now, the second statement is religion and technology might not be confined to research on religion and globalization. This might lead to a new category of membership that transcends boundary of one religion into forming a citizenship of the religious world community. Now, the framework within which I'll be discussing the two accounts is that citizenship of the religious world community. Now, a specific introduction on Facebook as a source for data on religions and socio-cultural values. The first assertion, I would say, a distinction has to be made between internet as a source of data and a powerful method of research. Now, in my submission, I'll be focusing on the first one. In this submission, I opted to utilize the data from the internet. I'm not using the internet as a method. The second assertion is the way Facebook, as a vehicle for social media, allows the human agent to be both public and private. And we would see this in the two examples I selected. More to the point, to be shaped the computer-mediated environment and allow offline life to be affected by online one. That was, as I said, that was a kind of exchange of ideas between me and my two daughters, and I think some of these things actually made a great sense to them, and that part of their sensibility in approaching and using Facebook as one of the vehicles of social media. How to study these two accounts? Question mark. And I think it's a very difficult thing. I never seen any article actually written about this, and I felt, well, perhaps I might be the first one to do so. This is what I might be wrong in this assumption, but since this is a preliminary inquiry into the subject matter of prejudice against the prevailing prejudice on the internet, while we aspire to create a new citizenship of religious world community, personal anecdotes and biased selections are inevitable at this stage of research. Well, that's my, my assertion, and I might be wrong. The second assertion, it should be noted that the phenomenology of religion will certainly guide this preliminary investigation in order that a reasonable level of objectivity can be maintained. This is how actually I approach the two accounts, and still I think I might not be correct in what I assumed in these two assertions. Now, the question of prejudice against the prevailing prejudice in the selected examples, I have these two selected fellows with whom I have shared friends, and both of them were my friends, and perhaps I knew them for the last 30 years. Imtiaz Yusuf is a professor of comparative religion, and he is the director of the Islam Buddhist Center in Mahidol University in Bangkok. Now, the two selected posts in his Facebook account, one of them is the yellowfish curry, and the second is knowledge liberates, I'm sorry for the typo, knowledge liberates from ignorance. Now, These two posts, the selection of them was based on one of them is having so many likes. I mean, the time span which I decided to focus on is only 12 days. And I realized that yellowfish curry had the most likes during this short period. And the second one has the most comments, as it will be shown later. Now, one of you would be asking, where is the prejudice against the prevailing prejudice in this post? The first one is very simple. You have got to keep in mind that Professor Imtiaz has, as his friends, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, Christians, whatever religion you think of are there, and of course some Muslims. He had that yellowfish curry post, which he made. And that's why it got most of the likes. And my feeling is that he is a male Muslim, so a male Muslim shouldn't be making curry, isn't it? Shouldn't be a cook. So most of these who were non-Muslims were surprised and showing their actually prevailing prejudice, against which actually he was making his own prejudice by showing that he can cook. And he is a good cook. Perhaps this is one way of seeing the dynamics of the prevailing prejudice or a prejudice against the prevailing prejudice. The second thing is knowledge liberates from ignorance. This post actually was about a book which was written in India, the Muslim India, the Mughal India, where Tariq, where the author actually was giving the biography of Buddha. And the book was telling the Muslims that all the way we are talking to Judeo-Christian world, having dialogue with them, and in return we are not getting anything. Whereas, the most important part, I guess, in the Muslim world is to have dialogue with the Buddhist, not the Judeo-Christian world, because the Judeo-Christian world, all the time, they ignored us. And it would be better for us now to turn our eyesight to turn west, to turn east instead of turning west, and that type of dialogue perhaps would be more important and more fruitful. So what was there? This is our prejudice, prevailing prejudice as a Muslim. We would like always to talk to Ahlul Kitab. And we feel that Ahlul Kitab are very closer to us. Ignore the Buddhist. But he felt that Muslims, before this, and that's why Islam actually was making inroads in Southeast Asia, it was because Muslims in India felt that it is important to know Buddhism as a religion and to see how to have a kind of an understanding of the sensibility behind this religion, and that's why Islam won, so many Buddhists to become Muslims. And I just would like to say this, that the biggest Buddhist temple in the world is in Indonesia. Now, the second, I think I have to skip this because otherwise he would tell me you have only 3 minutes. That's the Imtiaz. And this is actually he is hyperactive during the weekend posting things. And this is the curry thing, which he made. And that's the other post, okay? Well, I'm not talking about somebody who doesn't exist. Yeah. Now, this is the second person, Sulaiman Siddiqui Ali. He's a Sudanese, and these are the information about him. Perhaps I don't have to, I've got to, these are the 2 posts that I selected. I'm not going to comment on them. Perhaps if you are interested in this, during the break I would be talking about it. Now, let me go to the concluding remark of my story. I would like to give this, that admittedly social media in general and Facebook in particular have invaluable data on religion that might help us to understand the process of a citizenship of a religious world community in the making. The second thing I would like to share with you is that the study on the interaction between offline and online computer-mediated communication will allow us to understand how our own personal identities have been affected and shaped by this type of interaction. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Zain. So now, without any summary with regards to what our distinguished speakers have said, you have heard them all, and now I open the floor for question and answer and discussions. But also, again, I would like to remind you to be brief and direct, and if you have comments, so also please be brief. Thank you. So please raise your hand and introduce yourself briefly. Your name, perhaps, will be enough, and your institution. So we'll start our discussion. Is there anyone who is interested to comment or ask question or? Yes, here.
السلام عليكم. الدكتور جمال النقر من السودان. الأخ العزيز الدكتور إبراهيم الزين.
Dr. Ibrahim Zain, English or Arabic? I speak in Arabic now. I think that he's turned to English now.
هي أعظم جريمة في التاريخ لأنها تنتهك حرمات الشعوب العربية والإسلامية وهي المستهدفة because it is managed by the Western, and in the Western the CIA, and we know. So هي عبارة عن يعني
عفوا ملاحظة تقنية يعني بخصوص الترجمة، يا إما بالإنجليزي ولا بالعربي يكون أفضل، إما بالإنجليزي أو بالعربي.
أوكي بالعربي.
لغة واحدة حتى تكون
يعني هي الحقيقة يعني انتهاك للحرمات والأسرار الخاصة جدا. وطبعا إحنا رجال قانون، أنا كمحامي أعتقد إن
I think all religions do ban any espionage and any encroachment to any human rights. Do you agree with me, Dr. Ibrahim? This is my question. Thank you. Dr. Nuruddin?
Qatar University. I'd like to start from what Ms. Lula Al-Khater have ended, which is the developments in the public sphere with regard to the social media activism. And I'd like specifically to ask her concerning the electronic army that is being invested in by certain government in the region, and also beyond the region, in fact, to have a control on the discourse on what's going on in this sphere. What do you think about this? What do you think the repercussions of these developments? Because probably I'm not as pessimistic as my colleague over there with regard to what social media is providing. I am on the contrary. I am on the other side, probably trying to be in the middle. It has these pros and cons, like every medium. Like radio and television, like newspapers, you may think of social media as in the same. It's a tool, it's not an agent. It's a tool where we can invest in it and use it in the education, empowerment, enlightenment of people, or we can use it otherwise. So my question here is with regard to the electronic army and these new developments, because they are in fact new, especially with the blockading of Qatar and the Twitter issue, which has enormously
I shall say, affected the discourse about Qatar, for example, in citizens of the Gulf region. We know some governments are investing a lot. So this is a question to Ms. Lulua. The other question is to Dale Ackerman and other colleagues is regarding the also viewpoints to what they presented. I mean, I've captured a few areas, but I'm still not very kind of, I shall say, clear about how they see the power of these networks in empowering the public, if I may say. And Dr. Ibrahim gave an excellent example about how his daughters view the social media networks, and how he improved a lot on his presentation because of how they analyzed things for him, because they see things from a different zoom lens from how he sees the world and how he sees social media. So my question to all colleagues in the panel is how do you see these social networks empowering or otherwise the citizens of the world now and also in the future? وشكرا جزيلا.
We can take a response from our panelists, and then we'll take another round of questions if you wish. So please, would like to comment or start? Professor Dale, please.
Professor Dale.
First, by answering you, saying what we don't know. In terms of social networks, we can say in the past how they've grown. My favorite example is a slightly older example, which is Facebook, which began by being something where you had to have as an address, an email address, an address at one of approximately 9 different Ivy League schools in the United States. This didn't last for long. I forget what the figure is now. Is it something like 1.5 billion people? Who cares? It's a longer number than you're going to see in most of these. The interesting question is, what are the ties of networks? If we look at the spread of ideas, for instance, Rashid Rida, we're talking with people in this region at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. You can map out in charts who are the disciples, how do they communicate, obviously much more slowly, and get a sense of how ideas travel. Now, what we know about the social networks you're talking about is how much more rapid they are and how much they can change. And then the question is, are these deep networks, or exactly what does it mean to be a Facebook friend? Are you going to marry somebody because they're a Facebook friend? Probably not. It's a different level of engagement. And what does it mean? And the related question, when you talk about armies, electronic armies, first time I heard that phrase, I believe, was with Bashar al-Assad in the early 21st century. When people use the power of social media to distort messages or to track people down, then you get something else. One very quick example, when I talk to teenagers in the Sultanate of Oman, they know when it's time to stop using the electronic media. They know the government is listening, and as soon as it becomes dangerous to talk about certain things, then you go back to something more reliable. Face-to-face communications and other things. Electronic armies, for most people, or the electronic communications and networks, are one tool among many. They can distort. You can begin doing rumors much more quickly than 1989. You can say that Sheikh al-Bouti, Allah yarhamu, he's now dead, so I can say anything about him, is meeting, I'm making this up, by the way, so please, meets every Wednesday night with Sarah, the beautiful Mossad woman in the Golan Heights, and she tells him what to say in his very powerful television sermons. You can say something like that, and if you say it without smiling, somebody in Syria some time ago might believe you for a while. Social networks, electronic social networks, are very dangerous. You can ruin a person's reputation overnight, or you can create doubt about what people are saying. And we're at the stage now where we can't be complacent about these. The networks of Rashid Rida were easier to follow, much easier, or the Telegraph of a much earlier time, or Gamal Abdel Nasser speaking on the radio, the voice of the Arabs, was a master of top-down communications. But now we don't know the limits of these things, but as several people have said, what we do know is that the social media can create excellent ties, as my colleague has pointed out. They can also destroy.
Thanks, Professor. Lulu, please.
Thank you, Professor, for your question. You referred to the GCC crisis, right? And if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure if I have the figures right, but there was a hashtag attacking Al Jazeera. And someone decided, one of the institutions decided to do an analysis. You can look up the report that exists online, to do an analysis of the real tweets, like real people tweeting, and then the bots. And it turned out that 20%, only 20% of the tweets were real, authentic tweets. The rest, 80%, was just bots producing meaningless tweets. So this, in fact, speaks to the point Professor Ackerman was pointing at, which is the difficulty to, I would say, discern the fake news from the real news, reality from fiction, and so on and so forth, with the excellent example you made about, for example, Sheikh al-Bouti or whatever. So yes, this is an issue that we've seen like multiple times. Apparently there is a pattern, and in the GCC crisis it became very obvious. Now, if I am just to go to the theoretical level, I would say we're looking at two notions. One notion would be the authority, and the other one would be knowledge and knowledge production, right? And with traditional media, there was this fragmentation of authority when it comes to religious authority or political authority, right? What we're seeing now is fragmentation of authority altogether. There's no center of gravity in this social media. This is very important, regardless of all the manipulation strategies and so on and so forth, no center of gravity. But then fragmentation of the public space itself that this social media creates. Just to give you one example, why is it in the Arab Spring that the Facebook was the main medium? But then in the GCC crisis, it is Twitter. We're talking about two different spaces, two different audiences, and sometimes they talk to each other, but sometimes they don't. And within those, like media themselves, you would find another layer of fragmentation again. And I'm not sure to what extent, this fragmentation can go on. The other point would be knowledge production. And again, like scholars' authority, the shuyukh authority historically had to do with the power of producing knowledge and distributing knowledge. Now everyone with this phone can produce knowledge, regardless of whether it's good knowledge or bad knowledge, worthless or not, and so on and so forth. So no one can anticipate the future of that, I should say. I'm not an optimist myself about the future of these patterns we're seeing. I'm not sure if this is an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Zain, please. Yusuf first. Yes, okay. No problem. So just start.
طيب سريعا
I think that this is a philosophical kind of phenomenon. The idea that it is a circular kind of a prison, and there is one God in the middle. Everybody sees this God, but he doesn't see all of them. In Egypt, you know, the Egyptians are millions, and not all of them can be censored. However, a lot of them are arrested because of the social media as a deterrent, and the others will be indeed scared. For example, Mujtahid has an account on Twitter, and he tweets from within the Saudi regime. He will talk about issues. He's an insider. He uses conjecture and he follows up issues. But by and large, technology is a hard issue. He uses certain protection methods and so on and so forth. Technology is hard to be controlled. Thank you. 100%, I mean. Professor Zain. Yes, the gentleman who talked about espionage, I think that whoever controls the content of the Facebook, indeed, they have an avalanche of information for those who use Facebook. However, this doesn't mean that we need not to use it. I use the Facebook. I've used it for the last 5 years. I had an account, or an account was opened for me, and this account was used by me in order to liaise with my students, with my friends, and those who want to get acquainted with issues that I hold dear and want to know my insight, and so on and so forth. So I do not deny, and I do not substantiate the evil or the goodness of Facebook, but I think that it doesn't represent a threat on me in particular.
I mean, my submission was very limited, as I said. It's a very particular thing. I was looking into this critique of modernity, because you've got to keep in mind that modernity is the one that privatized religion, took religion out of the public space. And the guise under which that was done was this idea of prejudice, that religion is a kind of an unfounded prejudice. It's not factual. I mean, the method of knowing for modernity, I mean, epistemologically speaking, was that, I mean, after Kant did this critique of pure reason, whatever cannot be seen, whatever cannot be verified through empirical methods should not be given should not be given the right actually to be part of the public space, because it's not rational, because it's not empirical, and religion actually was moved because of this. I mean, the new Kantian and whoever followed that used that argument against religion, because religion is not rational, is a prejudice. Now, a critique of modernity, I guess, a very powerful critique of modernity was this prejudice against the prevailing prejudice of modernity. And I think the internet, and especially the Facebook, would give you the chance, would give you a kind of a platform to criticize the prevailing prejudice by advancing your own prejudice. I mean, if they wanted to call it a prejudice, it's okay, but in advancing your own prejudice, actually, your message can be heard in a public sphere. So this is what I felt. I felt that it's good for Muslims. I have these two whom I selected are two Muslim activists. And the two posts of the other guy whom I selected would show that, would show he himself, being a Muslim activist, was posting on the social media his own prejudice against the prevailing prejudice. And I think it did make a lot of sense. Whoever going to listen to the interaction between him and those who were listening to him would see that this is a new space which has been opened for religion actually to advance its own argument and perhaps to substitute the dominant argument of modernity. So, answer your question or not?
Yes, thank you, Professor Zain. Sulaiman and...
شكرا بروفيسور زيد. اسمي رامي. السلام عليكم.
قالت العرب, I will say this in Arabic then I'll translate. قالت
The Arabs said not everything that is announced is said, and not everything that is said should be said haphazardly. Not, he will interpret that right now.
To ability to publish and reach out to masses without thoroughly thinking and analyzing what they are writing. I give you an example. When Louvre a museum in Abu Dhabi published a map and removed Qatar from the map. So when I start looking at the posting and so on, all of it is emotional and so on. And this is where the power of knowledge comes. So what I did on my own initiative, I'm just giving this as an example. So I end up writing a letter in French to the Louvre management saying that by doing this, you are disrupting the French value of freedom of expression and the global and noble message of Louvre and its message. I just send it, and then later on, of course, for other reason and political reach out and the official channel and so on. So my idea is I encourage everybody before they post anything, they need to investigate and learn what are the laws, what are the regulation, what are the like for example in America, if two people argue and one of them is African American and there is a heated discussion, the African American will tell the other guy, is it because I'm black? So the idea is you start attacking that, oh, this is wrong because you are prejudiced. So the idea of prejudice can be used as a proper tool to make sure people are aligned and so on with the proper norm and so on. And the same thing, me as an Arab American living in the US for 21 years, whenever somebody do anything, is it because I'm Arab? I give you an example. One day, one of my coworkers came to me and said, Rami, your name is hard. Can I call you John? Okay? So I replied back to him, I said, Craig, your name is hard. Can I call you Muhammad? So immediately he span back saying, oh, I like my name. So then I reply back, I like my name too. So this is the idea. We need to apply logic as we reach out to social media. Thank you.
Khair, thank you. Rami, Sulaiman, please.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. I just wanted to see if I can hear a little bit, since maybe this might be the best panel for it. I mentioned in my morning remarks that added element of identity, and I was hoping to hear it. I know Sheikh Abdul Fattah Moro talked about young people today facing that duality, I mean, the dichotomy of what is in reality and what they're being told. A lot of fiqh that is still processing the context of the past and not really giving or translating it to the modern context. But I wanted to ask Dr. Ibrahim Zain more specifically, maybe Sister Lulu as well could add, and Brother Yusuf, on identity right there in self-censorship, right? So you gave us an example. It was a simple example of a professor or a friend that you have who lives in a majority Buddhist country in Thailand. And it was something very innocent that he was writing about. But let's take a flip side and say, had he mentioned something on his Facebook about the Rohingya crisis, where Buddhists are, killing Muslims, what would the repercussions then be? I mean, for his professional, advancement, I mean, later on maybe he can't get promoted, because the thing about the public sphere is that it's not just the here and now. Sometimes the things that we write now don't bite us now, they'll come back later on and bite us. The girl in France who made just a few Facebook comments about the attack in Nice when she was in highly advancing in the competition, The Voice, the France version of The Voice. Later on, the media was causing an uproar about what she had posted after the Nice attacks, and she had to withdraw somehow because of that pressure. So I really would like to hear this thing about identity and about, are we self-censoring just to be accepted? Are we self-censoring just, to not appear too religious or even moderately religious? I mean, can we not be ourselves anymore because of this expansion of the public sphere, and anything related to religious discourse could come back and haunt us? Jazakumullah khairan.
Okay, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Zakaria Abdul Hadi. I'm an associate professor of Islamic Thought and Culture at the College of Sharia and Islamic Studies at Qatar University. It's been a wonderful day so far. So many wonderful sessions that we have really good involvement and very interesting thoughts and provoking ideas. But let me just take us out from the concept of what the Facebook or Twitters and all those kind of tools, as Dr. Nuruddin was saying. They are merely tools. They were not there a few years ago. Now there are more new tools coming up, like WhatsApp, and they will still take a huge chunk of our audience and our freedom of speech and so on. I think it's better rather than just trying to see how can we eliminate or try to tackle those kind of tools, is that how can we utilize them? One thing that me and other group of researchers are involved is, because we are quite interested in the concept of, as Ms. Lura mentioned it, about the information or the Islamic information, or who is the scholars, or who is the methodology that you can determine whether this information is accurate or not. We're involved with research that are researching how the widespread of false Islamic information on Twitter and multimedia and other things. And we have noticed from a pilot study on the hadith itself, and how can the widespread of hadith da'if be so easily circulated through Twitter, like somebody can just send a tweet of a hadith and then it's unauthentic, and it's really spread throughout millions of people. So our team, who are IT specialists, managed to discover or find out a tool that it can resend for those persons who are circulating this Twitter, that will come immediately another tweet from the source that they are making to tell them that this tweet that you have just sent, it's unauthentic, it's a da'if, and it will quote for them the reference number of the collections and so on. So this is quite a serious issue, because we're not only talking here about aspects of hadith, but talking about Islamic information that could be really misused and done in a wrong manner. So what's your take on this? I would love to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. So to invite our distinguished speakers to respond briefly. Thank you. Professor Dale, please.
Thank you for reminding us on briefly. Several comments here, including Mr. Baz, remind me of something very important when we talk about different media. The media we're talking about dissolve the lines of formal speech and intimacy. They go so quickly between the two that it's hard. Let me give an example. There's a colleague of mine in Qatar now, an American, who, in my judgment, many of you will know, I'm not going to mention his name, writes, when he publishes academic books, he is focused, he is brilliant, he is very carefully checked. but he was one of the early users of blogs where anybody could tune in and look at them. And he had applied to go, well, I'm going to give his secret away, to Yale University. He was at a different university. And in his blog, he was very upset about matters that related to what was going on with Palestinians and Israel. As you know, Israel and Palestine are domestic American issues. Most Americans in Congress cannot separate the domestic implications from the international ones. He could not be further considered for the job. Of course, the universities would say things, but the root problem was taking a blog, which he thought was just friends, informal conversation electronically, and not realizing that 15 years ago, that these blog comments were just as real as anything else. And as you mentioned earlier, who would have thought that the semi-literate 140 character statements on Twitter would become the major way of hiring and firing people in the so-called leader of the free world. Now, leaving aside my political bias there, standing back, what interests me is the way in which there's this merging of formal statements with informal ones and letting them go out of control. And I think it's enough to identify what's going on right now and then to find ways of going against it. How simple, it's an example, somebody mentioned the Yemen here. You go back to when the Egyptian army was in the Yemen, there was a British intelligence officer, not a very pleasant man at all, but he did one thing that I sometimes think about. He started a rumor in the Yemen that the Egyptian currency had become devalued. And as a result, nobody wanted to give food to the Egyptian army. This was a more powerful way of stopping the British than anything else. This was like 1789, the power of rumor, not on radio, not on anything else to get things done. But now with electronic media, you can even get close to starting wars with 140 characters. We will catch up, but the question now is, because everything speeds up, the question is whether we can catch up in time to be as sophisticated about looking at false statements or statements meant to persuade by any dirty or clean way possible, if we're going to be able to catch up to protect ourselves in general against people manipulating us.
Thank you, Professor Ackerman. So any other response from the panelists, please? Lulua, later on?
Yeah, just
please.
a quick comment, as a matter of fact. It's a point of, and I think it speaks to all the comments that were made here. It's dismissing the context in social media. Context is always dismissed. إهدار السياق. Whether it's time, whether it's place, space, whether it's the circumstantial context, it's all dismissed. And that's why something you've written 15 years ago can hunt you back later on, but then without the context and the circumstances. Very recently, as part of the, of this polemic in the GCC crisis, there was one photo of soldiers standing next to a dead body. And then it went viral saying, those are Turkish soldiers in Qatar who killed a Qatari citizen, something like that. But then it turned out it was taken from another context in another country in a different time, a very different time. But then this is scary, because who is going to verify and check every single photo and every single tweet and it scares me. I mean, if any of the students, for example, or the scholars decide to write a narrative through social media about whatever, the GCC crisis, the Arab Spring, whatever event, How can they do that? How is this possible? So this is something to, and it speaks, it's very relevant to the discussion about the authentic hadiths and so on and so forth. Now, having alternatives just like the one you suggested is good, but then how do you make sure that it reaches every single person who received the original message? And there is another question. It's a very technical one, but it has its structural implications as well. The question of language. Content analysis in English is very advanced with the artificial intelligence, etc. But then with the Arabic content, beg your pardon, it's not that advanced. So again, I might make a statement, an ironic statement. How can a computer system detect this? And so on and so forth. So.
Just one thing. And just to answer your about Imtiaz. Actually, Imtiaz, if you go to his, Facebook account, he wrote an article on the Rohingya, and he was campaigning for the Rohingyas' rights. And I think he made a very clear stand on the issue. And most of the monks in Thailand, perhaps, because some of them were his students, were really enlightened by his statements on his Facebook account. So I don't think he shied away from making himself clear to these people. And I just would like to add one thing, that Imtiaz, he looks Indian. And I mean, he's from the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent. And when he was making the curry, actually he was making Thai curry. And the prejudice was this: here is a male Muslim, okay, and another prejudice who is an Indian, but he's capable of making Thai curry.
Thank you, Professor Zain. Now, with your permission, because of the time constraints and our session, the time for our session is almost over. So I would, with your permission, allow our distinguished speakers for 1 minute statement, final comment or statement if you wish. So feel free to start. Professor Ackerman, would you like to start first?
This has been a fascinating and unexpected sort of conference. We have had examples of every type of speech pattern here. We talk about new media. Sheikh Murroh, if I may, for the last time, invoke your style of speaking, a style which you also can, how can I say it, be ironic about. Irony is very helpful, I think, to us to recognize how easy it is to use new messages in old forms of delivery, or to use new forms of delivery for other messages. If I am frustrated about anything in this conference, it's that we have placed a number of things in focus to talk about, to conjoin, to put next to one another. We haven't had the time, I think, to look at the inaqasat, the implications of these different things. That's something which will come in stage 2. But there's a French anthropologist, Claude Lévi-Strauss, who uses a phrase I like, c'est bon à penser. There are certain ideas that are good to think with, and we've heard a number of them here today, both from the panels and from the questions. Thank you.
I just wanted to thank everyone for organizing this conference, Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, College of Islamic Studies, and HBKU, and the distinguished panelists. It was an honor to speak next to all of you. Thank you.
وأنا نفس الكلام.
I second what Ms. Lulu has said. May Allah reward you all. I ask Allah to set free the person who has established CILE, this important research center, Dr. Tariq Ramadhan. I call on Allah and I ask you all to pray for him in your prayers so that Allah will set him free.
Our panelists, and with your resilience and patience, I would like to thank you all and thank you very much, and inshallah, yeah, have a good day ahead. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
In the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful, may Allah send His peace and blessings to Prophet Muhammad, his household, and all his companions, and those who follow him till the day of judgment. Indeed, the final remarks was a habit of Dr. Tariq in each and every annual conference for the center, and he would always start by thanking and praising everybody who took part in making the conference a success, from the speakers to the interpreters to the volunteers to the members of CAN to the technical team to the staff of CILE Center and all the distinguished guests and those who watch. And we second that notion, and we thank everybody for their great efforts. But we cannot replace Dr. Tariq. Nobody can do that, in my view. So I will not try to take on that mission today. The issue of our international conference and its theme is something dealing with Dr. Tariq, and it is so near to his heart, and especially in his dealing with the West and the communities of Muslims in the West. Dr. Tariq Ramadhan is the first voice that has embodied the role of Islam in public discussions and discourse in the West and in France in particular. And even though some preachers and intellectuals were before him in Europe, however, Dr. Tariq was not an Islamic voice in a narrow sense, but rather he would give a point of view of what is Islamic regarding everything in the public sphere. He would call the Muslim communities to come out of their intellectual and social sequestration and to be present in all fields and to be engaged in all the deliberations in the public sphere, in all spheres of life and in all aspects. So that was indeed the habit of Dr. Tariq. And he is so, Dr. Tariq Ramadan is so, because he would call them to be engaged in different fields of activities in society, in social affairs, to environmental issues and animals' rights, to economy and famine in the world, reaching to the beautiful of artistic expression and wars and displacement and the issues of man and woman, etc. And against this background, there was the establishment of CILE Center, Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, with all its research abilities. Dr. Tariq Ramadan is the pioneer of theorizing for the Islamic presence in the West. He has written quite a lot to speak about the issue of diversity and multiplicity, showing the possibility of Muslims living in harmony in Western countries and secular states, and characterizing the individual roles which Muslims can play in those Western societies. And he considered the true diversity is the one that allows for each culture to crystallize its own thinking and views over common values such as human rights and general concepts such as modernity as a historical process. And he sees that the role of facing the hegemony of ideological modernity is because of the grassroots movements and the international organizations through contributing in the general discourse. And Dr. Tariq Ramadan would never consider religion as an element of privacy and sequestration. He would see religion rather as a heritage, a humanitarian heritage, a universal one that instills for social justice and ethics, and it is a source of inspiration for Muslims in discussing of principles and values that compels them to take part and be engaged in all spheres of life in order to realize a common living. And among the main tasks undertaken by Dr. Tariq Ramadan is the contribution in determining the status of Islam in modern societies, among them Western societies. And he wouldn't call for special privileges for Muslims in those societies or for amending the laws and constitutions. He would not even see in most of them what is different and countering the principles of Islam. And he would not even call for the review of the principle of secularism, but he would call for social justice and really exercising secularism, which means the neutrality of the state in terms of religious affiliation of its citizens, and that they do not interfere in religion. And it doesn't mean forbidden religion from entering into the public sphere. And then he would see that the citizenship of Muslims in those pluralistic societies and their effective contribution therein would not be achieved except through Muslims reconciling with themselves and with their memory, and not hiding their religious identity, because this is the condition of reconciling with the other. And citizenship will not be achieved through assimilation and melting in the society and hiding their identity. This talk, this discourse, is what has brought life and revived in the youth the faith that Muslims can succeed in those pluralistic societies without having to hide their religious identity and to abandon their principles. And Dr. Tariq Ramadan has embodied in his own person the paradigm of a religious person who announces his affiliation to Islam and exercising its principles with being open to society and to be successful in his international profession. Many youth look at him as a role model that should be emulated in his defense of the honor of the Muslims, with his behavior and with his speaking eloquently about the truth and meaning of Islam. And he is for them a Muslim who is liberated from the colonization, living in a pluralistic society in many forms. And through him, many Muslims have come to believe in the possibility of Muslims gaining their identity, the religious identity, in the pluralistic societies. However, some secular extremist currents in France specifically reject extremely any existence of religion in the public sphere, and thus they thought and saw in Dr. Tariq a threat that should be faced from the beginning. So they tried to dethrone him by so many ways, and we believe that Dr. Tariq Ramadan is today paying the price for the role that he has uptaken and for the faith that he has revived in the hearts of the youth. And this is evident in the treatment that is given to him. He was imprisoned under strict supervision in an isolation, and he was prevented from reaching his principal rights. He was not allowed to talk to his people. His sickness was not recognized, and there was no health care provided to him. All that with many claims against him without any evidence directed to him. And the media campaign against Dr. Tariq, which has tried him and convicted him even before the trial, and they delved in trying his thoughts and intellect and slandered his persona and has cast doubt on his intellectual abilities, is an evidence that what is targeted here is not the person of Dr. Tariq and what he is accused of specifically, but rather his intellect and what he symbolizes, and also a generation of youth who are of his style. So the purpose is to remove what they have of faith in the possibility of Muslims winning their identity and creating a feeling that this is just a mirage, this is something impossible, and that there is no hope in reconciliation. So the Muslim has two choices only: either to remain marginalized or to abandon his identity and to assimilate in society. And that takes us to the religious discourse in the public sphere, which is something very linked to courage. Dr. Tariq Ramadhan is not the first one or the only one who pays the price for this courage, and he wouldn't be the last one either. And with all what he has struggled and suffered because of accusations and claims, also he kept on going and speaking and struggling for the cause of tolerance. We in CILE Center take Dr. Tariq as a role model for us. Our work will continue with the will of Allah and God, and we will not despair from hope in Allah's will, and this will not undermine our will. So I thank you all once again. And the last thing that we say is all praise is due to Allah, God, Lord of the worlds.